So welcome to this session. I hope you enjoyed lunch. This is accelerating the adoption of innovation. And I think we've got a great panel today to talk about what really is a very, very complex subject. Now, I suppose this agenda item was first written pre-23rd of June and pre the Accelerated Access Review coming out. So improving the rate of uptake of innovation is a win-win situation for industry, government, health systems, and most importantly, patients, with several examples existing across the EU and US. With the launch of the UK's Accelerated Access Review, as you know, that was published 3 weeks ago, the EU's Prime designation and Breakthrough designation in the US. And I think since that was written, as I said, the Accelerated Access Review has been published, and clearly we had the momentous referendum vote on the 24th of June. Now, those of you who've been following the UK's position in life sciences regarding Brexit, a lot of it's around the negotiation stance and what we need in order to protect the industry, but also part of that argument as well is what we really need to grow and reinvigorate the industry as well. And one of the key assets that we have as the UK is the NHS. When we talk globally about the NHS, people recognise, yes, effectively represents a single patient, covers 80% of the population with 50 years worth of data. So a lot of the interest now is how can we actually turn that into an asset in terms of rapid uptake of innovation. So it's around that part of the topic that the panel today will be talking. So those of you who might have seen me yesterday, I'm Jo Pisani. I lead our Pharma and Life Sciences consulting business for PwC Strategy and a lot of my focus is around innovation and new models. And we assisted with 2 work streams on the Accelerated Access Review, the piece around adaptive licensing and flexible reimbursement. So I'm joined today by Mike Capaldi, who's from Summergos Innovations, where he's CEO. He's got a strong scientific background with over 30 years' experience in the pharmaceutical and life sciences industry. We identified that we worked together at Smith Beecham way back when as well, within the UK, Europe, and the US. Next to Mike, we've got James Yu, who very helpfully flew in this morning at 4 a.m, I think. So thank you for doing that, James. So he's from Cambridge Life Sciences, where he's chairman and CEO. James is a biopharmaceutical executive with extensive experience in general management, corporate strategy, operations, global business, market development, and R&D. And then we have Mohit Misra, to his left, from etzion, where he's Chief Medical Officer and Vice President of Health System. He's a licensed physician and trained health economist with over 10 years' experience of working with healthcare systems globally. And then Gino Martini from Roche Pharmaceuticals and from King's. So Professor Gino Martini's Professor of Pharmaceutical Innovation at King's College and Director of Rainbow Medical Engineering, which is Europe's largest centre for health education with world-renowned clinical services and research in physical and mental health. And at Roche, he's responsible for the outreach programme. And then finally, but no means least, we've got Amanda Begley from UCL Partners, Director of Innovation and Implementation. Amanda's Director of Innovation Implementation at UCL Partners and AHSN, with over 40, Academic Health Science Partnership, with over 40 education and NHS members, which together form one of the world leading centres for medical discovery, innovation and education. So hopefully today on the panel you'll see different perspectives around what we mean about accelerating innovation uptake. And maybe we'll just kick off initially with some perspectives from the panel. So Mike, do you want to kick off then?
Yes, indeed. So Summergos hasn't been around for very long in its current form. We actually span out of something that was previously known as Edinburgh Bioquarter. And we were there because the College of Medicine and Veterinary Medicine at the University of Edinburgh just didn't feel that it was maximising upon the innovation that it was creating. Whether that was through spin-out companies or whether that was through collaborating with industry or licensing products, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, just to make the point, because some of the discussion yesterday was around University Technology Transfer Offices, we're not the Technology Transfer Office for the university. We work with the Technology Transfer Office. So my view is the Technology Transfer Office need to be more generalist. I mean, if you think about a large university like Edinburgh University, imagine the range of technologies that come out from a university like that. Everything from astrophysics through medicine, through engineering, through whatever. There's no way a technology transfer office can be experts in all of that, but there are certain key areas where you deem, and technology tends to be one of those areas, and medicine another one of those areas, where you need to have specialists. So we were brought in by the College of Medicine and Veterinary Medicine as a group of specialists from industry. So my team is made up of people from industry, and we work with the college, and we now also work with NHS Lothian as well. So Scottish National Health Service, some of you may know, is sort of separate from NHS England and NHS Wales. It's divided up into boards. NHS Lothian, actually in terms of R&D, is the biggest board in Scotland. It does more clinical trials than any other board in Scotland. And it's quite innovative as well. There is an organisation in Scotland called SHIL, Scottish Health Innovation Limited, Scottish Health Innovation Limited, and again, sort of full of generalists. And NHS Lothian felt that they weren't getting good service from that organisation. And seeing as the university set up a group of people from industry and specialists from industry, they sort of came to join our party. So we look at innovation, we look for innovation, and we will do that either through, as I said, helping them to create spin-out companies, or we spend a lot of time going out into industry. We know what's going on within the university. We go out into industry, we listen to what industry wants, and we just try and bring the two sides together, to marry those together. And that works pretty well. A final point to make is that universities aren't particularly interested in making lots of money from their innovation. And sometimes I think industry gets this wrong. And I know sometimes technology transfer organizations gives themselves a bad rap because they tend to overvalue things. That's not because they're trying to make lots of money. It's actually usually just because they don't fully understand and they're a little bit out of touch with the sector. Universities basically are more concerned with impact, so the fact that their research is actually being used and is delivering something, societal benefit. Of course, they're not-for-profit organisations. They're not allowed to make a profit. They have to plough that back in. But it's also about reputation as well. And the more you can increase the reputation of your university, the more likely you are to be able to attract students and foreign students. And actually, that's what revenue to university is all about these days, getting students in who now pay high fees. And that's where the majority of university funding comes from now. So it's not about money. It's about good innovation, which the university wants to see being used out there for the benefit of society.
Interesting, you raised a point about NHS Scotland. Again, the Accelerated Access Review looks at the uptake of innovation amongst the NHS overall, and yet what you hear about Scotland is because of, it can be potentially more innovative and potentially a pilot for something. Would you agree with that, Mike, from your experience?
Well, it's very interesting. So every year for the last 5 years, we run what we call an innovation competition, and we do that across the University of Edinburgh and across NHS Lothian as well. And it's in healthcare, but it can be any part of the university or any part of the NHS. And I think out of the last 5 years, the winner, and it's a significant prize, we award £30,000 in prize money to the winner to help take the technology forward. I think 3 out of the 5 years, the innovations come from the NHS. Okay. But the one thing we've learned is that the NHS is incredibly time poor, so they come out with really good ideas, but then when you try and work with them to translate that into something and get it onto the market, it's a real struggle because they just don't have the time.
Yeah. Okay. Good. No, thanks, Mike. James, you've got some perspectives from other parts of the world.
Yeah. Well, good afternoon. Chris invited me to actually speak at this meeting last year, and at the last minute I had some conflict, so backed out. So I promised him to come back this year. And this is a very different year compared to last year, and given everything happened around. As Joe give a description of my background, it seemed to be like I have done a lot of everything, but it's actually not that extensive. But interestingly, when we talk about innovation, one of the first business transactions I have done with my former companies was with a UK-based company, Cambridge Antibody Technologies. It was a phage display license, antibody discovery license that I helped my previous company acquired. I also worked for one of the most innovative biotech companies for a decade, as Genzyme in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and now my company called Cambridge is a full circle. But over 12 years ago, I was tasked by Genzyme to introduce all of innovative products to China. We all know that disease. We do everything for innovation or innovatively. The end product is supposed to benefit patients, right? And we also know that disease have no borders, but patients do have borders. And innovation, I also think, have borders as well. So even though back then Genzyme was one of the top biopharma companies, it has a lot of innovative products, some of them best in class, like biopolymer or cell therapy, I was often felt myself very lonely in that very important market, just because when those products already launched in the US or in Western Europe, those products was very little known by the beneficiaries supposedly taking benefit from them. So year after year, I figured out that if you really want to have the utmost uptake of innovations, you actually have to think about them during the development stage, not when it's already ready for market. That would be too late. In my case, for example, I have to work a catch-up game with 20 products already launched globally. I only have 4 in my market as a general manager for Genzyme China. And so out of that, I would say the observation, 4 years ago, I founded Cambridge Life Sciences. Our goal is really to accelerate not just innovation itself, but also the uptake of innovation, not just from West to Asia, but somehow to engage Asia, in particular China, into the innovation process, both in the uptake and in the development stage. What we do is we identify highly unmet medical needs in oncology, in particular malignant solid tumors that has high prevalence and high mortality in East Asian and Chinese populations, and then acquires the license of clinical stage assets that are already developed partly by the Western or European or US partners, and then to have them, those assets further developed in those indications in a much more targeted way and accelerated way. Therefore, we can generate the proof of concept clinical data sooner and more relevant to those diseases than if we were not existing. So that not only benefit the patients in our geographies, but also patients elsewhere in the world. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay. And so, James, you talked about innovation coming from the West to Asia, and you'd like to see more coming from Asia beyond. When do you think we'll be at the point where there's either equilibrium or potentially Asia overtakes in terms of innovation exports?
Well, I think we already see the kind of the tipping point in the larger economy sense, right? Just use China as the example. We're not talking about the GDP. We're not talking about the infrastructure. We're just talking about the sheer size of the pharmaceutical markets. Now China is already second largest by a lot of measures. But most importantly is the innovation now has started to root in China in those technology areas. You have already seen Huawei, the smartphone company, announce their new generation of smartphone in Europe. Actually, that's the launch in Europe first. But in pharmaceuticals and biopharmaceuticals, there's so many Western trained executives and scholars now returned to China and to Asia. And also, because of the slowdown in the real estate market, the manufacturing sector, a large amount of capital now going into the high-tech and in particular life science areas, that currently the healthcare expenditure in China is only 5%, less than 6% of the total GDP in China, but we would see that at least doubled in the next decade. So all this would tell us the demand is there. It's just how we actually can harness all these resources and these demands and to create momentums and for innovation that benefit not just China, but globally as well.
Yeah, okay, that's great. Thanks for that, James. Mohit.
Well, thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me. So I think this is a really important topic, accelerating innovation and adoption of innovation. At Etzion, we are a software platform that develops evidence, and we develop evidence from large data sets of what works and doesn't work in healthcare. Whether it's a new drug, it's a new device, it's a new treatment pathway, it's a new model of care, we do what's called rapid cycle evaluations of what's working from a health and economic viewpoint. And I think we see ourselves as enabling adoption of innovation. So taking my clinician hat on, and when I used to practice medicine, is a lot of the people would say is doctors are slow to uptake new drugs and new devices, and we don't, many of my physician colleagues are still doing the same things they were doing, 15 years ago when I graduated from medical school. and they're a slow bunch to change. And they're probably a slow bunch to change is if you look at the numerous medicines that are out there. So if you take diabetes, for example, there's 3 or 4 different classes of drugs, and there's 5 different drugs in each class. We actually don't know which drugs work best in whom. So when you've got a new drug on the market, and I also sit on, in my other hat as a NICE committee, one of the questions we ask is where does this drug fit in the current treatment pathway, and which patients benefit most? The difficulty that you have these days with new drugs and the whole advent of precision medicine and the area that James works in is ever smaller trial populations. Phase 3 trials are becoming more expensive, more difficult to find the populations. So you struggle to generate the evidence of where the drugs are working best. So you need a new evidence generation paradigm where software solutions like ourselves enable that to happen, to develop the evidence specifically of which drugs work best, in whom, and when. And those are the questions that really aren't asked when you have market access in a phase 3 trial, and when you do phase 4 development studies, they're sort of prolonged and take a lot of time. So what we think and what we enable is rapid cycle evaluation, getting the evidence of what's working and what's not in days and weeks as opposed to months and years. And that's where we're having a lot of sort of traction across health systems across Europe and the US for people to tailor treatment pathways, tailor treatment protocols, and understand which innovations are working best in whom. Because we know drugs don't work well in everyone, they work in certain populations, and how do you find that out in real time and then work with the clinicians to develop pathways for specific patient cohorts. So we're all about, tailored medicines for tailored populations and developing evidence in real time to enable clinicians to make those evidence-based decisions. That's where I think it's important. One of the difficulties we face is access to data and access to real-world data across health systems. We work in the US, across most of Europe, and the governance arrangements in accessing data to be able to do the type of work we do is very difficult, and it'd be great to discuss that further on this panel.
Yeah, okay, that's great, Mohit. And you mentioned you've got experience working with a number of healthcare systems across the world. Which ones would you say are most receptive currently to things like rapid cycle evaluation that you described?
I think with all types of innovation, we probably know America. From our experience, the US healthcare systems are facing a lot of demands and cost pressures and rising demand. They're open to innovation, number one. They want to try new things. Number two, their data governance laws aren't as strict as they are in Europe, so they can use their data to leverage for these types of things. But there's an acute issue. I mean, we all know the price of pharmaceutical drugs in the US are 25 to 30% higher than they are in Europe. Yeah. So they have a real need to understand which drugs to use in which population. So we see a much quicker uptake of what we're doing out in the US market.
Yeah, okay, that's great. Gino.
Yeah, thanks, Joe, and obviously thank you to my co-panelists. So I used to work in industry. I used to work for Glaxo for many years, and then I became an academic at King's College, and I now work for Roche and still have my chair at King's. So I've seen the trials and tribulations from both sides of the fence, both from an academic perspective and also from an industrial perspective. And then the panel today was lessons learned and how to move forward. And I suppose I'm going to try and answer this in my various hats, my academic hat and my industrial hat. But I want to just read a little section from a letter that struck me that came out on the 4th of September. I'm going to paraphrase a little bit because it's a very long letter, and I'm happy to share the letter to everybody later on. It is about cancer medicines, because that's what struck me. And I'll read halfway through. If NICE decides to stop funding these drugs, and I won't mention who they are, they're not Roche drugs, then we will only be able to offer patients treatments that we've had a decade ago. This could also have an impact on patients in devolved nations, particularly Wales and Scotland. Another indirect consequence will be that the country will not be able to participate in international clinical trials, since we no longer be able to provide gold standard chemotherapy. These targeted drugs are routinely available to patients in much of Western Europe and North America. Reducing their availability in Britain would be a tragic and retrograde step. And that was Dr. Mark Saunders, the chairman of Beating Bowel Cancer, and Dr. Rob Glyn-Jones, chairman of the Bowel Cancer UK Medical Advisory Board, and 52 other important individuals. And that's my problem. If there's one thing that unites academia, industry, and NHS, is clinical trials. And that's my biggest worry. Whatever we do, I'm looking at Mike, an old friend of mine who's now at HSN, and a man on my left-hand side. we need to preserve our science base and our clinical expertise excellence in the UK because of the situation. And you know, and it's just, that's what struck me with that letter. It's a very long letter, and there's a good preamble into that letter, and that's what worries me. We need to learn going forwards with the new AAR and our interactions with HSNs and with NICE and the NHS. Let's not throw the baby out of the bathwater. Let's make sure we preserve our expertise in life sciences and in clinical trials. So let's look at it from an industrial point of view. And yes, there was mentioned quite a few times, and Professor Chas Bounter has been quoted a number of times. He's a personal friend of mine, and he quoted some data about phase 2B failure as well. Actually, if you look at the Tufts data 2014, when they reviewed, I think from 2002 to about 2013, all phase 3 clinical trials across all sectors, across all companies, small molecule, large molecule, the failure rate was 50%, roughly. Okay? Now, 50% failure rate is huge. Yeah, it hits your share price, you close down sites, and you know, I've been part of a site that's closed down, as a number of people in this audience have been. It isn't a pity place to be. So what do we need to do about it? We need to work in a very different way. We need to find ways to reduce the cost of development and to reduce the rate of failure. And you know, listen to what you've said, Mohit. We definitely need to look at real-world evidence and real-world data in a real focused way. How can we do that? How can we do that in a way that allows us to conduct those clinical trials in a very sensible way and in a way that allows us to reduce cost? Because if sites close down, it affects everybody. It just doesn't affect the pharmaceutical industry. It affects local economies and local populations. So I'm a very big advocate. Can we do things differently? Can we find different ways to operate? Can we work more closely with the NHS, utilising things like knockery more effectively to try and find clever ways to prevent this autumn of huge clinical trials with huge outcome endpoints and if they don't work, they don't work. And I think that's what we need to be doing to reduce the cost of failure and increase probability of success.
Okay, getting a lot of very strong nods there, Gino. And I think, again, if people were sat on the high-performance R&D session yesterday, you saw some great examples of where those things were happening from the company and academic perspective. I guess the link is the NHS. And Amanda, you work very closly in terms of innovation within the NHS setting. So please see all your views.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk very much about the into-practice element, which we've heard from members of the panel, and I'm going to talk a bit about the role of academic health science networks and use the NHS Innovation Accelerator, or the NIA, as an example of that. So the NIA is an accelerator which delivers a partnership between NHS England and the country's 15 academic health science networks. Its aim really is to take high-impact, promising innovations and to get it out to as many people as possible and to deliver benefit for patients, and then through that process to learn really what works and what doesn't work. The selection process is a sort of multi-phase, rigorous process involving patients, clinicians, implementation, commercial experts, information governance experts, drawn from a range of networks through our academic health science networks, NHS England, NICE, and so on. And it really aims to pick on the basis of finding fantastic people that are passionate about scaling innovation in the NHS, who have strong values and are open to learning and to share their learning. It's about picking high-impact innovations that have been demonstrated, even if on a small scale, that they can deliver better outcomes for patients and make a saving for the system, and also that it is an innovation that's facing a really systemic, significant challenge in getting into the NHS at any type of scale. So it really requires a national accelerator to take on board some of the challenges that are being faced. It's open to all types of innovation and entrepreneurs from a whole range of different sectors. So in the first 12 months, we've supported the first 17 fellows to take their innovations to an additional 389 NHS commissioners and providers, helped them to secure 17 million of external funding, and they've won 13 awards. They are quite outstanding individuals. It's been a privilege to work with them. And I suppose what it's demonstrated to us as an academic health science network, I suppose 3 key elements to an effective scaling strategy in the NHS. And so the first of that, which the AHSNs play a critical role in, is how do we support entrepreneurs How do we help them understand what's the right business model to get innovations into the NHS? Who are the kind of networks they need to be building, and helping them to build knowledge base really around a whole raft of different elements, whether that be how do you do procurement, how are things paid for in the NHS, what's the market, how do you create a compelling case for change, what is the sort of evidence that resonates with a commissioner and a clinician and a patient. The second element really is how do you match supply and demand. We've got a massive financial challenge in the NHS and a huge population need. There's a clear demand, regardless of whether you think that as a decision maker. And we have a whole host of fantastic innovations out there. And what AHSNs try and do is match those in a very efficient and effective way, not by asking people to spend a lot of money to sit on a stand at a conference in the hope that someone might come and talk to them, but in a way in which we can really have a deep understanding of what matters to our population, and then try and get the innovations in front of those decision makers to get things going and to support that conversation. And the third element really is the system characteristics. So interestingly, the CQC has been really fundamental in driving some of the NIA innovations, which I hadn't anticipated. One trust, who will remain nameless, replaced all of their scissors with epi-scissors, which is one of our innovations in advance of a CQC visit. And also CQC has been recommending innovations to other trusts as they go around, because they see something working in one area and they recommend that the organisation that they're meeting with looks into it and thinks about it themselves. The other aspect of, I think patient and clinical leadership is fundamental to provide some advocacy and legitimacy in a system that's very much patient and clinical leadership. And then we've had big discussions with NHS England around the current payment and reimbursement system in the NHS that makes it extremely difficult, even for great people, to work in new ways because they can't afford it. So, which has led to and informed the creation of the new Innovation and Technology Tariff, which we will trial in the first year, but hopefully will grow and expand, particularly beyond a secondary care tariff. So what's next? We've got another 8 inspiring innovators coming onto the programme, including a policeman, which I was really excited about. So we are then supporting our initial 17, so there's no point in spending a lot of time with fantastic individuals and then saying, right, 12 months, you're off. It takes quite a long time to scale in the NHS. So how do we build them as effective leaders, really, and experts in scaling, so they can mentor others in the system? And we're also helping them in the post-Brexit world to go international. So we don't want to be in insular England. We want to think about how do we support our companies to go across the world. We need to think about where does NIA and the HSNs fit within the Accelerated Access Review. How can we support some of the recommendations that have been proposed in that document? And really, how do we capture and share our learning more effectively? So the Health Foundation have commissioned an independent evaluation of the NIA for the first year, and we've adopted a kind of researcher in residence model for the current cohort to keep videoing our fellows and sitting in meetings with us. So I suppose in summary, I think it demonstrates, although we've got a really, really challenging time in the NHS is actually open to business. And partnership is fundamental, as well as starting with a clear understanding of need.
Okay, that's great, Amanda. And I'm right in thinking the sore throat test and treat initiative that was pretty well covered by the Telegraph and the BBC, wasn't it, on Saturday?
Yes,
that resulted from those.
There's been a lot of practice. It's a fantastic example of mass media and public demand hits the quite conservative nature of the NHS. So I was writing quite a few papers over the weekend, but we'll get there. Promising innovation may need a bit more evidence, but that's what the NIA is all about, really getting great things to people as early as possible.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. So I think you've seen, a snapshot from different sort of aspects of people participating in the industry there. Just a couple of questions that I'd pose to the panel, and then it's over to you. I suppose one thing, particularly underpinning the Accelerated Access Review, is the value of real-world evidence and data, both while products are under early market access in order to support the licensing of it, but then also after that, and also supporting flexible reimbursement schemes. So a question to the panel, really, what do you think some of the blocks are in terms of gathering real-world evidence from within the NHS, and how might they be overcome?
Can I sort of kick that one off?
Yeah.
It often amazes me that there are sometimes huge barriers in the NHS. So one thing I learnt when I went to Scotland, which I didn't realise beforehand, is that people in Scotland have actually had an individual electronic number for the last 30 years. So actually all patient records are electronic in Scotland. So you can, we've got cohorts of patients. There's the Lothian cohort, which is a cohort of school children in the Lothians that was followed since the 40s. We've got all that data followed all the way through. We've got other cohorts of patients which have been followed up, deeply phenotyped, deeply genotyped, have been followed for the last 30 years. And it seems to be one of the best kept secrets around. There's a massive source of data there which we can start mining straight away for real world data. And yet it seems to be one of the best kept secrets. There's a few academics that dip into it and do a little bit of research around it and write various papers. But sometimes I just feel there's this huge disconnect, and we're starting to see certainly NHS England now starting to get into genetic data and genetic mapping and some really good stuff starting to happen there. But I think we're missing some tricks. I think things like the Pharma Institute, I think that's been great, the way that that's been set up. But it's starting really, really slowly, I have to say. I mean, the Pharma Institute's been around now for, 18 months, nearly 2 years? And I'm not sure a huge amount has yet happened. I think there's been a lot of good talking. But I think sometimes it's just because the whole system seems so divided into subsystems that it's really difficult to pull the whole thing together and maximise on all that data. And I have to say, I think in terms of electronic patient records, the UK probably leads the world. I mean, maybe Norway is quite good in this respect as well, but they've got a smaller population. We lead the world, and yet we don't seem to be able to really capitalise upon that moving forward. So that's just an opening comment.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I'd love to, because we're in this space and we're experiencing it, and we have done for the last year and a half. So I echo, Mike, your points and Joe's. We are a one-payer system with electronic healthcare records going back to 1991, 92 now. So we are the first industrialised country to implement this in primary care. So we have a wealth of longitudinal information across a huge heterogeneous population of 60 million people. So we're a centralised one-payer system, but we're massively decentralised when it comes to the data assets. So in terms of the data assets that sit there, so we've got HES, which is the claims data set, which sits at NHS Digital now. And then we have CPRD, which a lot of people in the NHS don't even know about. So CPRD is an 8% cut of primary care data across the UK. And we're working with both examples. But I'll give you an example of data governance and access to data. So we're engaged with the Department of Health. They're interested in understanding special measures in hospitals and what the impact of those was, and they want to use sort of big data platforms like ours. So this is the Department of Health working with NHS Digital, who access to data. We're a software platform, and now we're 8 months into the discussion as how do we get access to that data, and how does the department give us the data to be able to do ask some of the questions. So if the Department of Health is struggling to do this type of work, what is it of hope for us? So we've just loaded up a first tranche of NHS data from 58 GP practices onto our system, but it's taken us the best part of 12 months to go through the governance to be able to do these things. So that's the first thing. But the second thing, coming back to what Gino was saying and his adaptive trials and phase 3, so I sit on the NICE committee, there is the acceptance of real-world evidence, from a pharmacological viewpoint. There is still perhaps a little bit of snootiness in the world about real-world evidence and relative to an RCT, and how can we trust it, and do we trust it, and do pragmatic trials work? And there's a cultural aspect of getting over that, I think, that we need to be able to get through for the data to even make sense. It's, what do you do with the evidence? It's the so what. And I think there's a few cultural aspects of what do we do with that evidence, and how is it accepted in the real world is another important thing that I think we're experiencing.
Yeah, so how do we affect a change then, I guess, Mohit? I mean, it sounds like a question of, sorry, Amanda.
I suppose there are areas of work, so that we've got the test beds now that actually have to become a test bed. You have to have integrated data sets available across a large population, across health and social care, and they are an asset really for us within the NHS and for academics as well, about how do you collect that data in the real world with a sign up from those institutions, NHS and academics, to use that data for testing and understanding the impact of innovation in real time. Certainly through the NIA, what we've experienced is where you have tools that collect real-world data that actually are of benefit to patients and to clinicians, you get significant more uptake. So if it isn't about the data, but actually it's I think OWISE, for example, is a breast cancer app which collects amazing data for researchers, but it makes a real difference to people's lives, and therefore it's going to, it's starting to take up from bringing it from the Netherlands to England. You've got Health Unlocked, which is a platform which has got 500 patient communities, and many of those have signed up to undertake state research. So it's a very quick and efficient way to access those people. Joint dementia research basically helps people connect with research trials at the point of diagnosis. So that there are lots of innovative ways in which, if we solve a need for a patient and a clinician, we can start getting access to these data sets, because people see it's not just about research, although that's really, really important, but actually sometimes busy clinicians and busy patients want to solve their own problem before they start thinking about others.
Yeah, and that's interesting. And I think it chimes very much with what Sir John Bell was saying yesterday about data, that almost these pockets of initiatives coming together, so it's harnessing that, but at the same time, I guess we do need some sort of oversight and governance, so it's striking that balance. So I guess that takes us to the worlds of sort of startup and entrepreneurs. We've got a couple of people on the panel who've run their own startups, etc. So what can we do in terms of making the UK culture more conducive to startups and entrepreneurship in the health system? Like, I don't know if you have to give that a shot, and maybe Gino and then James to compare and contrast with other countries.
Yeah, I mean, that's the $6 million question. I mean, you know, so we all know there's this large cultural difference between probably Western Europe and the USA. I mean, I've lived and worked in the USA for a few years. You know, if you go and ask a child in the USA what they want to be when they grow up, they'll tell you, I want to run my own company and be a millionaire. If you go and ask a kid in the UK, they'll say, I want to be a train driver or something like that. You know, so there is a deep sort of ingrained cultural feeling in some parts of the world that I just want to go out and make lots of money, and I'm driven by money. I'm not necessarily saying that's a good thing. I'm not necessarily saying that's the bad thing, but maybe that's why the US has got the biggest economy in the world, and why the UK is you know, quite a long way behind that. I'm not sure it's something that can be taught, but I do think what we can do is I think we can get much more entrepreneurially aware in our education systems, and I think that can start in school. I can always remember talking to the guys years and years ago when Research Triangle Park in North Carolina was actually on the planning board stage. Hadn't been built yet. 20 years before they actually started breaking ground there and building businesses, they put a committee together that went out to the local schools and actually started talking about the pharmaceutical industry and what it would mean for the US economy and what it would mean for the local economy. And what their vision was that in 15 years' time, we will have a generation of kids coming out of our local schools that will want to go and work in those industries on our research park. And so it's something that is sort of planned, and I don't think we do enough of that in this country. And even at universities, I mean, what we should be doing is that, and actually this is something we've started doing in the College of Medicine at Edinburgh, with all the new PhD students coming in. We just bring them in for a day and we just talk about the pharmaceutical industry and how drugs are developed, and you know, how startups work and how you raise money for companies, and we tell them a few case studies about successes we've had in Edinburgh just to inspire them and show them the sorts of things that can be done. But it's actually only something we've started doing recently, and yet when you think about it, it's probably something, and it's only one day, it's one day of their time, and it means they leave there and they're quite motivated, and they look at the sorts of successes that we have had, and they can go and speak to those people. And it starts to get a bit of a buzz going. So I think it's those types of things. Yeah. You know, I'm not sure there's any one button that we push and say, right, that's that one solved. But you know, it's a cultural thing as much as anything. Great, I mean, we could go into access to venture capital and those types of things, but we'd be here all afternoon.
Yeah, and that sort of cultural change, you need to address things like The Apprentice, which, you know, is not necessarily the best of entrepreneurship as we see.
No, I'm not sure the best examples come out there, but it's good television rather than good business,
isn't it? People need to look at that. Okay, Gino, you've had your hand in a couple of startups over the...
Well, yeah. I'm also... I do have interest in a startup funding club in London, so I've been in the space now for at least 3-4 years. I would never have done that if I hadn't left GSK to become an academic. So there's some very interesting things that you do when you move around. I think mindset. So I talked to a couple of my American colleagues, and they think we're nuts because you've got free healthcare, free education. What's your risk? Now you think about it. If you live in the United States, you know, you don't have any free healthcare, and often, you know, and the education, let's face it, you have to pay for it. And so their mentality is different. The other thing I've noticed as well, failure is not as well tolerated in the UK compared to the US, and that's a fact of life. You've really got to get it right the first time, maybe second time, certainly not a third time. And yet look at some of the entrepreneurs in the US, they've tried many things and they've failed. So I think there's the mindset aspect and the fact that you're not taking a risk because, in the UK we do have free healthcare now. You need to understand what an important asset that is. And then of course there's the basics like funding protection, like tax R&D credits, like the SEIS schemes, enterprise investment schemes, where you can get a lot of your tax back when you put your personal money in. And so I've used that successfully a number of times, and it's a very, very good incentive. So I think we've got that. And then when I did my elevator speech to one of my colleagues in South San Francisco about, why is Roche UK a good place to be? He said, well, you're 20 minutes away from the Crick, and Howard's over there, and we do talk about the Crick. We talk about the Wellcome Trust, we talk about the University of London, because when I talk about universities, I don't talk about King's, I talk about UCL, I talk about Imperial, really great centres of excellence. We've got Manchester, I'm a graduate and PhD from Manchester. You look at what's going on in Devo Mank, and in Edinburgh. We have some really good pockets of expertise, and again, the NHS, access to patients. So for me, the UK's got a lot to play for. I'm ignoring Brexit because I think we could do a lot still with Europe and collaborate, because I'm still going to collaborate with my colleagues in Italy. I'm half Italian, why wouldn't I? And people in France. So we've got a lot to play for still, and I think we mustn't underestimate how much infrastructure already exists that actually helps entrepreneurs. The only thing I would say, a lot of the entrepreneurs I have dealt with, I get some really good entrepreneurs, people who get it, who listen to people, who listen to advice, and some that maybe don't, repeatedly don't. They wonder why the business fails, and I think that there's maybe some mentorship or some formal education programs in our universities might be something that needs to happen as a mandate rather than as it's optional.
Yeah. So, okay, that's great. Thanks, Jane.
Can I add an afterthought? Yeah. I mean, one other thing I would say is that if we look at the UK as a whole, I think there's actually it's a little bit disjointed in terms of where entrepreneurial support comes from, and I'm talking particularly about venture capital. So I'll give you one statistic that came out of the BioCity report, Glenn Crocker's BioCity report, I think in 2014, where he looked at life science seed funding across the UK. So if you look at the 2014 Universities Research Excellence Framework, it ranks all the universities by research power. And actually what it showed is you go to the Golden Triangle, if you consider Cambridge, Oxford and London, in the life sciences, the Golden Triangle accounts for about 45% of the UK's life science research power, so just under half. If you look at where seed funding goes in the life sciences, 80% of it goes into the Golden Triangle. Now you think about this from UK PLC's point of view, that means 55% of our life science research power is fighting for the other 20% of seed capital. And actually that means we're missing stuff and we're wasting stuff. And the one plea I would make, and we see this all the time with industry. Industry spends its whole time knocking on the doors of Oxford, Cambridge and Imperial and UCL. Trying to get them on a train up to Edinburgh is like asking them to come to Iceland or something sometimes, So, I think there is a balance somehow that needs to be restored here. And this is all about building ecosystems. And obviously the ecosystem is tremendous. I mean, I'm not taking anything away from what's happened in Cambridge or what's happened in Oxford and what's continuing to happen in London. But if we keep focusing all our effort on the Golden Triangle, we're going to keep missing stuff in the rest of the UK, which is producing more of actually the innovation potentially.
Yeah. And it's been very key to sort of when the government talks about industrial strategy, making sure it's got a sense of place there as well. So yes, the Golden Triangle, yes, is maybe the poster on that, but in fact, the fact you can distribute the wealth across and the economic impact it has, I think, is quite key. So hopefully that should feature in that. Just like quickly to go to James, to a view as an entrepreneur in Beijing about looking at the UK or your own experiences in entrepreneurship. What do you think needs to change?
Maybe I'll start a little bit earlier than Beijing. I had the fortune to start my career in Silicon Valley, in the Bay Area. My first job actually, when I was still a postdoc at UCSF, my advisor was a serial entrepreneur. He founded 4 or 5 biotech companies, a good friend of Herbert Boyer. So my first ever company that I worked for, the people who were there founded a company were the founding scientists of Genentech, who already become loaded. They sold out their shares, and financially, of course, they were kind of the poster child for those poor, just incoming new employees. But I think that aspiration to do well is one of that. But after years, I've been working for example, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It became, in the last decade, the really true hub of biotech of the world. In particular, Kendall Square area. I started working in Kendall Square back in 2001, when Genzyme was only one of the few companies there. But now we have a lot of rethinking about why that area particularly becomes so bustling in biotech. And one lesson learned after having many meetings with not just the executives, but also NGOs like Mathematic or MassBio. One conclusion is the tolerance of failure is not just a mentality, it's actually an ecosystem like just mentioned. We have seen a lot of companies comes and goes, but you don't see a lot of jobs lost, because when one scientist or one executive lost a company because that lost a job because the company went down under, immediately be picked up by another company. So in net is actually an increase. And secondly is you must have realized a lot of large farmers, they've moved their R&D centers in the Kendall Square area. And that actually helped a lot with those smaller companies in terms of their risk tolerance. Why? Because many of those companies not necessarily rely on just privately raising money or that dilutive financing to keep alive. They have a lot of examples of over $100 million deals for early stage companies that they actually can raise more money than otherwise they would raise from venture capital firms. I think this really would become a lifeline of the true confidence in being an entrepreneur. You don't need to worry about losing your house mortgage or anything else. And then back to Beijing, to China, I think a lot of people felt maybe China is either a communist or socialist country where the government dominated the economy. But if you really go down into the data, you'll be surprised that 70%, over 70% of all the job employment were provided by non-state-owned companies. And over 70% of tax revenues actually also generated by non-state-owned companies. So that already tells you that that country's economy is propelled by a lot of entrepreneurs collectively. And secondly, I have worked with, in the industry. I was part of the RDPAC as a general manager. And over the years, I found out if you look at MNCs, of course, MNCs offer a lot of very good paying jobs, very nice working environment. But if you look at the middle and upper level management team, and the higher you go, the few male employees you will find. I mean, some companies have basically 90% of female top executives. And what happened is actually when they started, there will be slightly more higher female population percentage-wise. But in the Chinese culture, I think for those, whether it's culture-wide or whether it's hormonal thing, is when a male become successful at some age or some stage, if they do not run their own enterprise, if they do not create their own thing or they become their own boss, they would feel that they haven't achieved their ultimate goal yet. So that's kind of part of the culture, I guess. So it's create a problem for management team, of course. But on the other hand, you really do not need to incentivize people for them to taking risks.
No, that's right. Okay, there's some great perspectives there. I'm keen to open it up to the audience now. So looking at Vicky to see if we've had any questions come in at all.
We have a few.
Okay. And then we'll take a couple of these and then we'll go around with the mic as well. So do we have any questions coming up? Don't know if I can read them. Oh, Graham Cox from yesterday as well. Hello, Graham. What's the IP situation like now in China? Are there generics out before patents have expired? That's one.
Yeah.
And the question for Gino, There, 50% of phase 3s were in molecules that were not proven at phase 2. Technical risks were shifted to phase 3. So how can you improve the ROI through a better design of phase 2? So maybe just have some quick answers, because I'll open it up to the audience in the room as well.
Yeah.
So James, just on the IP situation.
I was on both sides of the equation in terms of protecting my portfolio and then now protecting my own company's innovations. I would say that the IP issue in China has improved significantly. And if you have filed and granted a patent, in particular in the composition matters in China, you'll get the same protection as you get anywhere else in the Western world. Often we have seen it's the company were not, they did not file the patent when they filed the global IP application, and therefore they don't have that protection. On the other hand, I want to say that if you go to see the news around China, what the CFDA is doing is just fantastic. They basically ask every company who are in the generic business to do a self-examination of their NDA submission. And if they concluded that that part of NDA submission, even back in 2 decades, have tainted data or violation of IPs, they have to unilaterally withdraw those applications, therefore withdraw those products from the market. If they do not, if they get caught, the whole company's drug license, not just their particular product license, the whole company's license will be revoked for 10 years. So that actually, in the past 24 months, resulted in about 70% of the application withdrawn by themselves.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty severe. Were many people in the audience aware of that? It's just James mentioned it over to me over lunch. That's, yeah, it is amazing. Yeah. And Gino, sort of quickly on the phase 2 versus phase 3.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, that was, to Graham's question, I mean, that was data that was pooled over a decade. So clearly things have moved on, expanded phase 2 trials, combined biomarkers. I think people try to look at that. And then the other one, of course, is adaptive licensing, look and see, see if things are working or not. So, I mean, there's still evidence that there's still experiments that we're looking into as an industry. If you look at cancer as well, basket trials, umbrella trials, so there's all this, trying to do things slightly differently and looking at data earlier is what they're trying to do to mitigate risk. But I think the jury's still out.
Yeah, okay. And then a question here on clinical trials from Edit. So where is the role of the NHS in the setup of multinational clinical trials, which most innovations require? So I guess we're talking about NOCRI and those sorts of systems there.
Yeah. Well, all I can say on that, though, we do an awful lot of clinical trials in the UK as a company, okay? And a lot more than that. I was really surprised
I think Roche does the highest by number when we did
well,
that
I didn't want to say that, Joe, but you said it. But we do a huge amount. So we're doing that already. So from our point of view, and more to come, hopefully.
Yeah. Okay.
I want to add one point to that multinational trial, because we actually, as a company, will run multinational trials. But like Roche or Pfizer, they would involve fewer Asian patients and mostly Westerners. Our trials are more designed to both have the majority are Asians and then the minority are Westerns or Caucasians, because the disease, for example, esophageal cancer, that is the highest prevalent cancers amongst Asians, and it will be often very hard to recruit treatment-naive patients in the West. And just one particular example that the trials that we're working on is squamous esophageal cancer, that over 95% of Asian patients are squamous type, but the majority of the Western patients are adenosine type. So those two types actually would respond to the treatment very differently. So therefore, I think it would be very cost efficient that we would run an Asian-centered multinational trial that involve several dozen Western patients for pivotal study that we actually can achieve a global approval.
Yeah, okay, that's great. Maybe I'll throw it open to the room now. So we've got a couple of hands up. So maybe this gentleman here and then over to this lady over here. So that's, if you can say who you are and who you're representing as well.
Thank you. My name is Mark Dooman. I'm a patient. And my question is less around the side of clinical trials and much more around the bedside. We've heard very nicely from Amanda about HSNs. I have diabetes as well as non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, I hasten to add, as a Scot. The issue I have is working in digital health and all these promises of accelerators and all the rest of it is I don't see any joined-up thinking in the NHS. I see 200 CCGs left to do things to themselves. I see hundreds of trusts doing their own thing. And despite the best efforts of AHSNs and others, I don't see an NHS diffusion or adoption button. NICE doesn't seem to work for medicines. What are we doing about having clinicians having the independence to make their own clinical decisions at the same time as having some sort of standardized pathways? And how are we going to get that supposed 17 years, not even down to 10 years, but down to a year, as Bruce Keogh wants to change the things?
That's right. Is that you, Amanda?
Yeah, I agree. I think there are a huge number of initiatives out there to try and support innovation across the innovation pipeline, and particularly around how do you get it into practice. They aren't, and we certainly, when we set up the NHS Innovation Accelerator, we did a lot of mapping around what already exists. There isn't a lot that I think sits into that adoption into practice at scale side of things. We have been in discussions with NHS England, and I know they've now they've built a sort of innovation team. There certainly seems to be more a commitment to ensure that that doesn't sit as a separate entity within NHS England, but actually sits alongside strategy. And because I think one of the key issues we've got is you had for example, the proposals coming around for sustainability and transformation plans, and innovation was mentioned twice in the annex. So it wasn't core to what those sustainability and transformation plans are supposed to be about. That we're starting to see some changes in that, certainly with our engagement with our STPs. We have 44 footprints across the country, which starts to bring a smaller number of conversations rather than sort of 200 and plus CCGs and so on. But I think NHS England have understood there is a lot of infrastructure out there. It isn't coherently knitted together, which makes it very difficult for entrepreneurs and also makes it very difficult for NHS colleagues to understand what support is available. I think we also need to do quite a lot around building capacity for implementation in the system, because when you're busy in the whirlwind of the day job, dealing with just reactive issues and patient care, it's very difficult for you to have the time and space and capacity to actually implement the changes. But I think we're positive that STPs give a platform to help to do that in a more concentrated way. And NHS England certainly are working on how do we pull that resource together around innovation and ensure it becomes part of the strategy rather than just a separate unit.
Yeah. Okay, great. We've got a question over here.
Yeah, it's very much along the same lines. We hear a very rosy picture. We have the NHS, we have all sorts of things, but in actual fact, it is still extremely hard to get stuff done in the UK. And I mean, in a recent multinational trial that recruited 1,000 patients, we helped the company identify how many patients we had in the UK. We managed to get 3 patients into that study, and they were all recruited after the study had finished, because of the R&D officers not blocking, but all the delays. Each one has to be negotiated individually. It's things like this. Yeah, the NHS is a great asset, but we've got to make it a better asset than it currently is, because there's little point carrying on saying everything is rosy when it's quite clear that there are problems. I mean, so number one, I think we need better navigation through the system, so we know where to go. As an example, recently as well, I mean, we were trying to get real-time pricing, real-time evidence for pricing payment by results for a fairly expensive drug. The company were up for it, everybody else was up for it, but the NHS weren't. I mean, how are we ever going to move while these blocks are all in place? And it just seems, I mean, it's exactly what the previous gentleman was saying, it's the blocks are everywhere, and you overcome one block and you come to another one.
Can I just make one comment on it? It is possible. So NHS Scotland does everything through a single office, so you can get R&D approval in about an average of 17 days in Scotland for a multi-centre clinical trial. So it is possible. It's just a question of getting different parts of the NHS to work together and talk together.
And similarly...
So if we're going to accelerate stuff, why can't NHS England learn from NHS Scotland and implement exactly the same process in England?
So I mean, certainly in UCL Partners, we have a single sign-off process, a single price negotiation, and it's open across our 6 million population. And that's been about getting the chief executives and the universities together and saying, we can't wait months and months and months for this to happen. We need to make sure our patients have access to the right innovations as quickly as possible. So it can happen. It wasn't. We had 10 months to do it, and that's what we did. And now we're certainly, mirroring Scotland in terms of the access to trials in our patch. There are other partnerships are working on a similar model.
Yeah. Okay, I'll do my best to sum up now because we're running into Tina's panel in a couple of minutes to see some people coming in. But just I think what we're hearing is some great examples of what maybe some positive routes here in terms of accelerating innovation. But we just need to do it with more velocity and be much more joined up about it between industry and academia, between the different parts of the NHS and those sorts of things, and hopefully learn from some of the global experience that we've seen there in entrepreneurship. We had a deep dive into real-world evidence and some of the concerns around that, and some of the more sort of cultural issues and what we can learn. But I think it really is key that this is, one of the foundation points for industrial strategy as we work through EU transition, and absolutely vital that we get it right. So please join me in thanking the panel members today.